Welcome to the latest breaking updates and sharp commentary on the Outward Insight channel. Ladies and gentlemen, the world has now officially crossed the most dangerous red line since the end of the Second World War. Set aside the cheap diplomatic threats made over the past few days by Donald Trump and his ally Israel. Because overnight the Middle East ceased to be a chessboard of mere pawns. Iran has flipped the table. A message as cold as steel, reportedly issued from the office of Moshaba Kameh, left the world stunned as Throne declared that it now possessed nuclear warheads. But the shock did not stop there. A newly leaked classified dossier has left behind radioactive traces that cannot be denied. All roads lead straight to Pyongyang. Kim Jong-un has made his move. Shipments of death slip through the dense surveillance web of the West, turning Iran into a true beast armed with nuclear fangs. Now Israel's artillery is loaded, and Iran's finger rests on the trigger. When two adversaries stare at each other through the scope of weapons of mass destruction, the world stands only a blink away from catastrophe. But set aside all moral slogans and look directly at the brutal reality. How could an Iran surrounded and sanctioned from all sides manage to perfect its nuclear power right under the noses of American and Israeli intelligence? How deep does the covert connection between Pyongyang and Tehran run when Washington accuses Kim Jong-un of igniting this nightmare? And the question hanging over humanity at this moment is this: what will happen if just one side loses control and presses the launch button? Today's video is not for the faint of heart. We will dissect the most horrifying scenario of World War II, from black market supply lines to the moment the first bomb could tear open the skies over the Middle East. The geopolitical map stands on the brink of being redrawn in ash and dust. And you need to know what truly awaits behind the curtain of war declarations. The nuclear code has emerged. A stunning intelligence blow has left the United States and Israel reeling. In the world of intelligence ghosts, mistakes are not paid for merely with money, but with the shaking of entire empires: the Pentagon, the CIA, and Mossad. The machines that once arrogantly believed they could scan every square meter of the Earth with satellites and algorithms have now suffered one of the most painful and humiliating blows of the era. While supercomputers in Langley were busy analyzing every crack in public nuclear facilities like Natanz and Fordo, Tehran quietly staged a cold-blooded disappearing act, turning the West's billion-dollar surveillance system into a set of blind eyes. Iran was never naive enough to put all its eggs in one basket, as many Western analysts once imagined. For 2 decades, under the harshest sanctions, Tehran did not choose open confrontation above ground. They dug deep, very deep. They built an entire underground world that military experts call cities beneath the earth. These labyrinths cut into limestone mountain ranges as hard as steel. There, uranium enrichment did not operate in the traditional way. Iran severed nearly all signal connections with the outside world. No internet, no radio waves, no thermal leakage large enough for American infrared sensors to detect. While inspectors from the International Atomic Energy Agency were still painstakingly counting old generation centrifuges at exposed facilities, the sharpest strategic minds of the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps were quietly moving the core of the program hundreds of meters underground. These were bunkers so deep that even America's heaviest bunker buster bombs would be like hopeless knocks on a steel door. What intelligence circles are whispering about as the nuclear code is no exaggeration. It is the result of technological optimization taken to an extreme. The West always believed Iran was still at least 2 to 3 years away from obtaining a viable nuclear deterrent, because they assumed Tehran had not yet solved the problem of warhead miniaturization. But that was the fatal mistake. A bulky nuclear bomb belongs to the thinking of the last century, suited to great powers that like to flex their muscles. A warhead weighing only a few hundred kilograms, small enough to fit into the nose cone of a modern missile, is the true weapon of those who dominate the game through silence and precision. Using self-made composite materials and advanced metalwork technology that Washington once believed Iran could never reach, Tehran appears to have moved close to producing an extremely compact trigger mechanism with the destructive power of tens of thousands of tons of TNT. That means any mobile launcher currently hidden in Iran's mountain hangars could become the spark for an unimaginable geopolitical upheaval. The United States and Israel are no longer facing a few fixed targets. They now face the prospect of a whole array of mobile deterrent capabilities that could emerge from anywhere. Why did Washington fail to detect an event capable of shifting the entire balance of global power? The answer lies in the arrogance of technology and the depth of Iran's strategy. Tehran turned old mines and abandoned hydroelectric structures into phantom laboratories. They created false electronic signals and staged deliberately careless exchanges to give American listening stations something to celebrate collecting. While Washington congratulated itself for intercepting electronic component shipments from Europe, Iran had already completed a transit network through third countries. Beneath those seemingly worn-out shipments of machinery were sophisticated microprocessors and control systems. Tehran turned encirclement into motivation for self-reliance. It no longer depended entirely on imported centrifuges or Western components. It cast, built, and operated everything itself in such a closed cycle that even the densest spy network struggled to penetrate it. The appearance of this nuclear code is hard proof of the deep failure of the maximum pressure strategy. The United States and Israel used every weapon they had, from computer viruses like Stuxnet to assassinations targeting nuclear scientists in the heart of Thrawn. But instead of breaking Iran's will, they only made the country more cautious, more secretive, and more dangerous. The message now coming from Iran's leadership is no longer a plea for negotiation. It is the declaration of an actor that has prepared itself for the harshest possible scenario. The revelation of nuclear deterrent capability, at the exact moment the US-Israel alliance increased military pressure, was a move calculated with chilling precision. It transforms conventional war into a nuclear gamble, where just one misstep by Washington could force the entire alliance in the Gulf to pay a devastating price. Throne understands that in a world where international law is often bent by the strong, ultimate self-defense is the only shield capable of protecting the throne of sovereignty. They did not choose a loud desert test that would give the enemy time to prepare. They revealed their hand only when everything appeared to be near operational readiness. That is the posture of a nation prepared to go all the way if driven into a corner. Yet one question remains unavoidable for experts. How could a country under comprehensive sanctions and nearly constant surveillance make such a rapid leap in warhead miniaturization? One of the most difficult military secrets on Earth. Iran alone, however resilient, would have struggled to complete that entire process in only a few short years. The smell of gunpowder and the echo of radiation now seem not to rise only from the underground bunkers in the mountains. They carry with them a familiar trace from Northeast Asia, where a country has spent decades confronting the United States and treating nuclear power as its ultimate survival tool. Many intelligence clues, from the oscillation frequencies of explosive materials to the structure of the warhead casing, seem to point in one direction only. Pyongyang, the North Korean leader, who recently appeared with that enigmatic smile across the news, may have completed a covert deal capable of shifting the global balance. How did those deadly suitcases carrying the essence of North Korea's nuclear expertise cross half the planet, pierce America's thick web of control, and arrive safely in Thrawn? Who guided them there? And what was the real price Iran paid for this strategic treasure? The transcontinental nuclear pipeline has come into view. Iran's connection with Pyongyang has left the United States powerless. When darkness falls over the mountain ranges of Central Asia, one of the most sophisticated military logistics operations in history may have begun moving in silence. The West has always taken pride in its ability to control the global flow of money and goods, but it forgot one brutal rule. When pushed to the brink, determined nations create roads that no satellite or radar can touch. The ghost of Pyongyang is no longer a hypothesis. It has become a presence, quietly feeding energy into the Middle Eastern equation. The reason American intelligence claims North Korea transferred technology to Iran lies in the astonishing similarity between the warhead designs Thrawn has hinted at and those previously seen in Pyongyang's missile programs. This is no coincidence. In the world of covert arms trading, North Korea is not merely a state. It is a warehouse of nuclear experience, built and refined under sanctions for decades. This transaction did not pass through the international financial system. It operated through an older but highly effective method: barter. Iran needed warhead miniaturization technology and precise detonation techniques that Pyongyang had already perfected through repeated testing. In return, North Korea needed energy, financial resources, and above all, valuable real combat data from Iran's confrontations with Western air defense systems. This is a symbiotic link between a military technology hub and a regional energy power. The biggest question is how such sensitive components could have slipped through America's dense control network. The answer lies in the art of hiding in plain sight. The IRGC, working with North Korean intelligence, reportedly built a disguised civilian air transport network. Old cargo aircraft flying under commercial cover move continuously from Pyongyang through transit points in Central Asia, landing in discrete military zones around Tehran. Inside crates labeled as civilian equipment were separated components of warhead systems and control microchips. Each flight carried only a small part, but hundreds of flights over many years were enough to complete the full structure. The United States focused on fleets at sea and overlooked the vast skies of Central Asia, which became a dangerous blind spot in its surveillance system. Mossad, once renowned for deep infiltration operations, appears to have been completely neutralized this time. Communications between Thrawn and Pyongyang did not rely on digital technology. Experts exchanged hand-drawn blueprints, physical models, and worked in shielded rooms, fully isolated from signals. The West may hear signals from space, but it cannot access what takes place deep inside the mountains. The combination of North Korea's iron discipline and Iran's discrete strategic capability created an intelligence shield that was almost impossible to penetrate. While the West searched for software traces, Iran completed the hardware by crude but devastatingly effective means. Pyongyang's support for Tehran was not merely cooperation, it was a sharp geopolitical move, forcing the United States to split its resources toward the Middle East and reduce pressure in Northeast Asia. Washington fell into a dilemma. To strike Iran might provoke a reaction from North Korea. To do nothing, however, would shake America's alliance system in the Gulf. Simply by transferring technology, Pyongyang has indirectly altered America's global position. The reality is clear. The deterrent capability Iran has built, bearing North Korean technical fingerprints, was designed to endure, to operate reliably, and to survive modern defense layers. With this support, Iran has moved closer to a state of strategic readiness. That places enormous pressure on Israel, where every military decision is now shadowed by the risk of uncontrollable escalation. The technology has been transferred, the systems are functioning, and the fragile balance is being tested. The remaining question is not whether this could happen, but when the scenario slips out of control, who will take the first step, and how far the consequences will spread? Israel, the beast driven into a corner, and the Samson option. In the dictionary of MSAD and the Israeli military, there has never been such a thing as accepting defeat. And yet, right now, inside the ultra-secret Kira command bunker in Tel Aviv, the atmosphere is thick with unprecedented tension. Iran's declaration of nuclear capability is not merely a hardline statement. It is a direct blow to the foundations of Israel's survival, forcing the entire security apparatus into a state of absolute alert. While the West remains stunned, Tehran has calmly asserted itself as a power not easily subdued, forcing its adversary into a state of extreme reaction and loss of control. The vegan doctrine has guided Tel Aviv for decades with one principle: no adversary may be allowed to possess weapons of mass destruction. But that doctrine now faces a life or death test because Iran is no longer in a passive posture. It has moved into a calculated position of strategic initiative. For Israel's leadership, allowing Iran to accumulate a nuclear deterrent is simply unacceptable, because even a single nuclear strike on Tel Aviv could erase the entire national structure within minutes. That is why Israel is being pushed toward preemption, even while fully understanding that the price could be an irreversible catastrophe. Military sources suggest that F-35 squadrons have entered their highest state of readiness, preparing for the scenario of penetrating thousands of kilometers deep into Iranian territory and confronting the multi-layered air defense network thoroughly built and reinforced over many years. But Iran is no longer the vulnerable target Tel Aviv has faced in the past. Strategic facilities have been dispersed, camouflaged, and protected inside hardened underground structures, turning any preemptive strike into an enormous gamble whose chances of success grow thinner by the day. If Israel cannot neutralize Iran's entire deterrent capability in the first blow, the result may be a chain reaction of destruction beyond every scenario of control. Within Israel's military elite exists a final option, known as the Samson Doctrine, an extreme contingency prepared for an existential scenario in which the entire nuclear arsenal could be unleashed if the country faces the prospect of total annihilation. This is not merely deterrence. It is a cold warning that if Israel collapses, everything else will be dragged down in a storm of indiscriminate destruction. Meanwhile, Iran retains the initiative through a multi-layered strategy, combining missile forces, drones, and a network of allied groups surrounding Israel from multiple directions, creating continuous pressure that wears down enemy defenses hour by hour. Hezbollah in the north, Hamas in the south, and pro-Iranian forces in Syria form a ring of fire, tightening around Israel's strategic space, pushing every defensive calculation to the limit. This is how Throne exploits asymmetric advantage, dragging its adversary into a war of attrition where no air defense system, however advanced, can endure endless pressure forever. Under that strain, Israel is forced to escalate, shifting from deterrence to increasingly intense preemptive strikes. But with every blow, the region edges closer to the point of no return. The world watches each radar signal in breathless silence, because a single miscalculation or a misunderstood order could trigger a chain reaction beyond control. Iran has demonstrated resilience and adaptability beyond all predictions, turning pressure into momentum and forcing its enemy to expose its own limits. Israel now faces not merely one state, but an integrated strategic system built over decades with formidable depth and discipline. When driven to the wall, every option becomes extreme and existential. And once the boundaries are erased, the question is no longer who wins or loses, but whether humanity itself can survive the consequences of one single mistake capable of unleashing a nuclear storm across the planet. Now imagine placing yourself in the position of a people who have been sanctioned, strangled, and hunted, whose brightest minds have been targeted for half a century. When powers from across the ocean and regional rivals alike keep forcing you into a corner, what remains? Submission or standing upright in self-determination to protect your nation? If Throne is ultimately forced to press the button, then in this narrative, it is not an act of aggression, but what is framed as a legitimate act of survival by a resilient state under prolonged hegemonic pressure. Recent days as presented here have laid bare strikes aimed at civilian infrastructure, sources of life, and the sovereignty of an independent nation. Iran in this framing has restrained itself to the final limit, but every limit has a breaking point. When combat squadrons carrying a nuclear threat move close to its airspace, Tehran no longer has strategic room to retreat. In that scenario, the order to launch from Mojaba Kame would not be an impulsive act, but a command to defend territory, faith, and national honor. Ballistic missile silos would awaken at once. Warheads bearing the symbols of self-reliance and resolve would tear open the sky, heading straight toward military command centers and deployment bases of opposing forces. At the very moment the order is given, defense systems once celebrated as invincible would reveal their limits before a counterstrike accumulated over decades. No shield can fully stop a will compressed and hardened over half a century. Missiles with evasive trajectories and strong penetration capability would exploit every blind spot in the warning system, reducing reaction time to an absolute minimum. Within minutes, key command centers would be disabled, command structures paralyzed, and the balance of power overturned. This would be framed not as meaningless destruction, but as a reordering under the logic of forced self-defense. Not only direct targets, but regional bases used to project hostile force would also fall within the scope of retaliation. Throne has made it clear in this narrative that any platform serving aggression becomes a legitimate target. As fleets come under unprecedented pressure, the image of the untouchable superpower would be tested to the limit. This is the warning. No country can impose its will by force without paying the price. Iran in this framing does not reach outward to wage war. It focuses only on threats coming directly to its doorstep. While the West worries about radioactive consequences, history records that other battlefields have already been poisoned before by other kinds of weapons. If Thrawn launches, a chain reaction becomes almost unavoidable. Yet, Iran's position would then be that of a people willing to endure in order to defend sovereignty. Iranian society in this narrative has prepared for harsh scenarios with shelter systems and a steel-like spirit forged across generations. While societies accustomed to stability may collapse internally when faced with total crisis, that internal fracture may become the decisive factor in the long-term outcome. After such a collision, the regional order would be rewritten. The presence of outside powers would be thrown into question, and many nations would begin reassessing the balance of power. In this scenario, Thrawn's actions would carry not only military meaning, but also signal the right of self-determination for nations unwilling to be dictated to. From that perspective, nuclear capability is not merely a tool, but a symbol of strategic independence. History may record that when pushed to its limit, Iran chose to stand firm and force its adversaries to confront the consequences of their own decisions. Justice in war always carries a brutal cost, and sometimes that cost is the shaking of an entire sky. Iran does not seek conflict, this narrative insists, but stands ready to face it if forced as a resolute nation. In the eyes of many, this may be controversial, but for those who value autonomy, it is framed as a powerful affirmation of the will to endure. Even so, the scenario does not stop on one side because the opponent would never accept defeat, and the danger of extreme escalation always remains. Israel activates an annihilation scenario. Iran stands firm before a nuclear storm. For years, the world has been covered in polished layers of rhetoric about self-defense. But once we look directly at the core, that curtain falls away to reveal a cold truth. When one power is driven into a corner and its hegemonic calculations are shattered by Iran's determination, its choice may no longer be retreat, but to drag everything down into the abyss. The Samson option is not merely a military doctrine. It is the desperate reflex of an entity unwilling to lose control, prepared to hurl the entire region into catastrophe to preserve a wavering position. In that context, once Iran's deterrent locks down the opposing side's war command centers, Israel's elite may be pushed toward the outermost extreme. They could be prepared to open the entire nuclear arsenal, hidden in underground bunkers and aboard strategic sea-based platforms. This would no longer be a conventional military response, but an act of wide-area destruction beyond every norm of warfare. Unlike Iran's framed approach of targeted defensive retaliation, the Israeli scenario here aims at large-scale incineration, with warheads configured for maximum thermal and blast effects, turning vast regions into seas of fire. Millions of innocent civilians would become victims of decisions made in a crisis of power, when fear of losing position overwhelms every moral boundary. In this scenario, America would not stand aside. Washington, with its surveillance, targeting, and technical support systems, would become a key factor in increasing the effectiveness of such strikes, creating a cold coordination between power and ambition. For them in this portrayal, maintaining geopolitical influence may be placed above all humanitarian cost. This is the clearest exposure of extreme power logic, where human beings become variables fit for sacrifice. Once the nuclear reign begins, the consequences would not stop within the region. Radioactive dust would spread through atmospheric currents, hit global ecosystems, threaten food supply chains, and shake the entire foundation of the world economy. A dangerous precedent would be set if ultimate weapons were used not for deterrence, but for suppression. Cities drowned in nuclear light would become an unforgettable scar in human memory. Yet even in the harshest scenario, Iran's spirit in this narrative would remain unbroken. Beneath hundreds of meters of rock, protective forces and scientific teams would continue maintaining final response systems, preparing for the worst imaginable conditions. They would understand that they were standing on the front line of a struggle that extends beyond territory itself. The struggle to defend self-determination against pressure imposed from outside. If this extreme scenario were triggered, it would not simply mark the end of one chapter, but would strip away the true nature of those who invoke order in order to preserve power. However immense the losses, the image of a resilient Iran would become a symbol of an unconquered will. A people may endure devastating blows, but not lose their identity or their resolve to defend sovereignty. History always remembers such moments, when material power confronts the power of will. An invader may destroy infrastructure, but cannot extinguish a people's desire to endure. And from the ashes of conflict, a new order may emerge, in which power no longer rests on unilateral imposition. But the final question still hangs like a sword overhead. After such a nuclear storm, would this planet still be fit to sustain life? And how deeply would the global economy collapse when the world's energy center is paralyzed by radiation and irreparable rupture? Iran triggers a geopolitical reaction. An economic black hole swallows the dollar empire. When the first nuclear clouds ignite over the Middle East, it would not only mark the end of lives, but also sound the death knell for the global financial system built over decades on domination and extraction. A world once run on oil flowing from Iran and the Gulf, and on the absolute supremacy of the US dollar, would immediately plunge into a bottomless economic void. This is the harsh price that the US-Israel alliance in this narrative would face for choosing force to crush the pride of a resilient nation. Look at the global energy map. The Strait of Hormuz is the artery that feeds industrial civilization from Asia to Europe. If Iran were to exercise what it calls legitimate self-defense through retaliatory strikes against opposing forces, this area would instantly become an impassable zone. No oil tanker, no insurance company would dare enter radioactive and high-risk waters. 20 to 30% of global oil supply could vanish in a single night, and this time there would be no recovery scenario. Major oil fields in Saudi Arabia and the UAE, locations previously used as military staging points, would be seriously affected, leaving extraction almost paralyzed. Oil would no longer be priced in ordinary numbers. It would become a scarce resource beyond every forecast. Western economies built on cheap energy would begin to buckle under unprecedented shortage. The foundation of American power tied to the petrodollar system would shake at its roots once oil supply is disrupted, and the international community grasps the consequences of coercive decisions. Confidence in the dollar would collapse with terrifying speed. Financial markets in New York and London would witness free fall in an instant. Trillions in asset value would be erased, and Western banking systems would face a domino effect. Citizens in developed nations would discover that the numbers in their bank accounts cannot protect them from a real crisis. A wave of flight from the dollar would spread across the globe, producing a financial earthquake never before seen. This would no longer be about traditional sanctions. It would be the direct consequence in this narrative of Throne's fierce resistance under prolonged pressure. As the Middle East descends into crisis, the entire global supply chain from Asia to Europe would fracture. Factories in Europe would shut down for lack of energy. Distribution systems in the United States would empty as strategic sea lanes fall silent. The consumption model built on cheap resources would collapse entirely. A food and goods crisis would spread across the developed world, forcing societies long accustomed to abundance to face a far harsher reality. In that context, only nations with strong internal capacity and strategic autonomy would be able to preserve stability. New economic alignments would emerge as countries outside the conflict seek to build independent payment systems detached from the dollar's grip. Iran, though damaged in infrastructure, would in this narrative become one of the centers of a new regional economic order because of its steadfast posture. Many countries would look to Thrawn as a symbol of self-reliance and resilience under external pressure. An economic model based on respect for sovereignty rather than coercion through force would begin to form through these upheavals. Economic collapse would not exist only in numbers, but in a deeper transformation of global thinking. The world would realize that the model of endless consumption sustained by conflict had pushed the planet toward a dangerous edge. In that context, Iran's role would not only be to defend its territory, but also to force the international community to re-examine the entire current power structure. Every dollar from that point onward would carry the memory of an unstable era created by disastrous decisions. This is the price in this narrative that coercive powers would face: declining influence and harsh judgment from history. As the economic black hole expands, systems once thought solid would gradually collapse, leaving space for new orders to emerge. Iran would not only defend itself with strength, but also help break the asymmetric financial constraints that have endured for too long. Yet, amid this chaos, the choices of other great powers would be decisive, because their response would shape the future of the international system and the possibility of survival in a post-crisis world. Iran forces the superpower to bow. World order tilts under Eastern pressure. For decades, the world has operated beneath the shadow of two nuclear superpowers, the United States and Russia. entities that place themselves in the role of deciding the fate of the globe. But once Tyrone reveals a deterrent capability of decisive force, the geopolitical chessboard is completely reoriented. For the first time in modern history, states that possess arsenals sufficient to destroy the planet would have to tread carefully before the will of a nation determined not to submit. Washington would fall into a strategic crisis not foreseen even in Pentagon scenarios. Symbols of power, such as aircraft carriers and stealth fighters, would lose much of their effectiveness against an adversary willing to sacrifice everything to defend sovereignty. The American leader would be driven into a dilemma: escalate and risk a chain nuclear reaction, or step back and lose hegemonic stature. The posture of imposing order through force would now be replaced by a need for restraint and dialogue. The myth of an unchallengeable superpower would begin to crack when reality proved that technology and finance cannot break an iron will. Meanwhile, Moscow and Beijing would watch with calculated calm. They would recognize that Iran is doing part of the most difficult work in breaking the ring of power in the Middle East. Indirect diplomatic informational support would create a strategic cushion, allowing Tehran to withstand the pressure. Russia would see in Iran a valuable partner in rebalancing the order while seizing opportunities to strengthen influence elsewhere. As the United States is dragged deeper into the spiral of crisis, the global balance of power would begin to shift. Military alliances once considered firm would start to tremble as countries realize that the protective umbrella is no longer absolute. Many states would be forced to reassess their strategic choices, no longer relying entirely on Washington, but searching for new balancing options. Iran's assertion of deterrent capability would throw traditional security doctrines into doubt. A truly multipolar order would begin to take shape, where strength lies not only in resources or weapons, but in willpower and endurance. Iran would have shown that even a country under siege can alter the behavior of superpowers if it preserves enough resolve and strategic patience. The age of monopolizing the world's fate would come to an end. Every intervention from now on would have to calculate uncontrollable risks. The world would no longer revolve around a handful of centers of power, but would begin moving toward new anchors where nations dare to stand and defend their sovereignty. The superpowers would be forced to learn respect and negotiation rather than imposition, because any mistake could lead to irreversible consequences. If the parties failed to control the situation, the danger of escalation remains. Yet with clear-headed leadership, the possibility of restraining the conflict would still exist. In that setting, Iran would rise as a new center of influence, a symbol of steadfastness and resilience under the harshest pressure. After this crisis, Throne's position would be strengthened as a crucial pillar in the region and more broadly on the global chessboard. Humanity would remember this period as the moment old limits were shattered and a new order began forming out of violent upheaval. The Middle East, once merely a conflict hotspot, would transform into the place where the balance of power is redefined. Iran's deterrent capability in this view would not just be a military instrument, but a factor creating a new equilibrium. Justice in international relations would no longer be a concept shaped only by the strong, but would begin to attach itself to the right of nations to decide their own fate. Before a people willing to defend every inch of their land, every tool of coercion reveals its limits. Truth always exists beyond every layer of media framing, and the core question still remains: who brings conflict and who rises to defend sovereignty? So, in your view, amid tensions and escalation like those we see today, will a truly new world order emerge? Or will humanity continue to be dragged into an endless spiral of confrontation? Leave your thoughts in the comments section. If you found this analysis useful, please like the video and subscribe to the Outward Insight channel so you do not miss the next developments. For now, thank you for watching, and we look forward to seeing you again in the next.